Hello and thanks for watching. In this short video, I'll demonstrate how the Forum Sentry API Security Gateway can enable and simplify complex API workflows through its point-and-click task list engine. I'll show how a single API request into Sentry can generate multiple side channel API calls. The purpose of these side calls is to enrich the original API request before ultimately sending it to the target application. This type of processing is often referred to as API workflow enablement or API orchestration. There are 5 steps to this simple inventory API workflow. The goal is to make one API request with an item ID and get back the price and shipping time for that item. However, the availability, price, and shipping time applications are all individual microservices with their own API endpoints. Forum Sentry is deployed as a secure gateway for the inventory API, virtualizing the endpoint, terminating SSL, checking HTTP methods, preventing malicious requests, validating schema and query parameters, managing identity and access control, enabling single sign-on, preventing data leakage, etc. In this case, Sentry is also simplifying the API workflow so that the client app only needs to make a single API call to retrieve data that is collected from several backend applications. First, the app will call into the virtual directory on Forum Sentry to invoke the inventory API. The app will include the item ID and a zip code to ship to. Sentry will capture the item ID from the request and make a call to the count API to determine how many items are available. If there are no items available, Sentry will return the appropriate response to the app. If there is inventory, Sentry will make a second call to the ship time API to determine the shipping time given the zip code. If shipping is unavailable, Sentry will return the appropriate failure to the app. If shipping is available, Sentry will make a call to the inventory API, including the item ID and zip from the original request, as well as the count and ship time parameters from the enrichment calls. The inventory API will return a JSON payload with the requested pricing and shipping data, which Sentry will inspect and ultimately return to the app. This workflow is enabled via a simple Sentry task list. First, we match the type of API call to a get price request. Sentry captures the postal zip code and the item ID from the incoming request and maps them to user attributes, which are stored in memory for later use. And next, Sentry calls out to the count API, and it includes the item ID query parameter from the original request. When inventory is available, Sentry maps the count in the API response to a user attribute and then calls out to the shipping time API, again, including the item ID and zip code from the original request. If shipping is available for this zip code, Sentry then sends that original request parameter and 2 new query parameters, which were retrieved from the previous 2 API calls, to the inventory API. Let's view the policies in Sentry for this simple workflow use case. The entire API workflow will utilize a single REST policy in Sentry. The virtual directory is the endpoint that the client app will call. The physical URI is the inventory API, the backend application. Attached to this REST policy is our task list that enables the API workflow previously described. We can see there are 5 tasks, starting with conditional identification, which matches the correct API call to get price. Then there are the 2 enriched message tasks that call out to the count and ship time APIs. And finally, the task that adds new query parameters to the original request, which is then sent down to the inventory API. Let's see this policy in action. Using the SoapCenter API testing tool, I'll make my API request into the Sentry policy, specifying a zip code and an item ID. You'll notice I get a valid response back with the price and shipping time for this item ID. This was a successful transaction. For a back end, I'm using the Cloud Port Simulator tool, which has endpoints defined for each API we're invoking in this demo. I'll clear the transaction viewer and then send another request from my app. Notice the 3 transactions show up after I make just a single call for my app. The first is the call to the count API, then a call to the shipping time API, and finally the call to the inventory API. Looking at the request coming into the inventory API, you'll notice there are 2 additional query parameters that are not passed from my client app. From a Sentry logging perspective, there's only a single transaction for this entire workflow. We can find that one transaction in the access log and then see the details in the system log. The debug level log provides rich detail and shows all the enrichment calls with requests and responses and all of the processing that is happening in Sentry for this entire workflow. Please note that Forum Sentry is available as a hardware appliance, virtual appliance for VMware, in the Amazon and Azure clouds, and as a single package install for Linux, Windows, or Solaris. That's all for now. Thank you very much for watching, and if you would like more information, please visit us at www.forumsys.com.